the first YouTube lesson, I think we should spend on finishing idealism, or better say, classical liberalism. Classical liberalism, of course, as I mentioned in the first lecture, end with the Second World War. Why? Because the idealism, this school of international relations, it rises because of the outbreak of the First World War, and then scholars would like to find some drugs, you can say drugs, to prescribe to the world so as to prevent the outbreak of war again. However, war outbreak again. So that means the original drugs, that is idealism, fails. Say when you get the coronavirus, maybe the doctor prescribes some drugs for you. The first type of drug failed to cure you. Then the doctor have to give you another kind of drugs. So firstly, the main reason for the downfall of classical liberalism or idealism is because of the outbreak of Second World War. And also, as you can recall what I mentioned in the last lecture 2 weeks ago, that democracy promotes peace. However, those asset states, particularly Germany, was a democracy. Of course, when the Second World War broke out, Germany's democracy has already collapsed, and then Germany was transferred to, of course, a totalitarian regime. 即係呢個極權政體 totalitarian regime. But at that time, of course, there's no opinion poll. But generally speaking, this is a perception of most people. The majority, the mainstream of society, supports Hitler to launch war. So this apparently contradictory to the theory of idealism, that is, democracy promotes peace. No, democracy no longer promotes peace. Why? Secondly, as I mentioned in the last lecture, you can recall from it that international institutions can promote peace. However, unfortunately, the League of Nations, if you talk history in DSE, you know that the League of Nations, it could not function to prevent the outbreak of war. The best example is in 1941, Japan invaded China, occupy the so-called northeastern three provinces. Then the League of Nations sent a panel to investigate, and then the result of the investigation is that Japan really invaded China. The League of Nations just passed a motion to ask Japan to, the army of Japan to retreat from the northeastern provinces of China. But that's it. Then Japan simply quit the League of Nations. Then Japan did not need to face any consequence. So the League of Nations cannot function. This is the first example of League of Nations cannot function. And then later, Italy conquered Ethiopia. Then League of Nations can also not prevent Italy from conquering Ethiopia. So League of Nations, this system cannot stop the aggression of Axis states, Italy, Germany, and Japan. Italy, Germany, Japan, yes. And then international trade. International trade in the 1920s to 30s is still quite vibrant. But after the outbreak of so-called Great Depression, I think you may have some you may know what is Great Depression. Particularly if you took the course global political economy, know that there was a Great Depression happened in 1929. That Great Depression is the greatest stock market collapse all time. Even the problem is more severe than the 2008 financial tsunami. Then, every country, in order to protect its own market, adopt a policy called protectionism. That is a kind of trade war. A kind of trade war when goods from other country would like to import into your own markets, then the government needs the importers to pay a lot of tax. So the international trade collapsed rapidly in 1920s. Declined rapidly in the late 1920s and 1930s. So then afterwards there's an outbreak of war, Second World War. So international trade cannot prevent, of course, it's disrupted by the Great Depression, and then the vibrant international trade in the 1920s could not stop later the war in late 1930s and early 1940s. So that means the so-called Kantian triangle cannot function to stop the outbreak of Second World War. That's why the drug prescribed by idealism to stop the outbreak of war fails to function. So this one is Ishikao. I will talk about Ishikao more in details when I teach you about so-called the realism. His theory we will talk about later, next lesson. But this lesson we just mainly concentrate on his criticism of liberalism. He thinks that idealism, and in fact, let's say, the term utopian or utopianism, this label was created by him to, you can say, shame classical liberalism. This is a label invented by him. So, what is his criticism? Firstly, he thinks that liberalism profoundly misread the facts of history and misunderstood the nature of how. In fact, he considered those so-called Kantian triangles, those three principles like international institutions, like democracy, like trade. They represent the interests of halves, because like the institution, international laws protect those who have vested interests, protect those like states like United Kingdom, France, and United States. They protect free trade. Free trade favors this kind of states whose economy are very developed. Those developing states like Germany, like Soviet Union, they cannot represent, their interests cannot represent in the current you can say the current international laws and institutions. So they would like to overthrow the current international institutions and law in order to, say, represent the interests. For instance, like Germany. Germany, you know, I think, as I mentioned in the first lecture, the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles, the terms of Treaty of Versailles, 凡爾賽條約, is overwhelmingly favorable to those winners in the First World War. Like German lost a lot of important cities in foreign states to France and to Poland. And then German's army is forced to be reduced to the size of 100,000. So Germany have to pay a lot of compensation for so-called a war crime. But in fact, the First World War, you can say there's no, the responsibility for the outbreak of First World War should not be borne solely by Germany, but by other states, including Britain, including France. You know that when I briefly introduced the history of First World War in the first lecture. So it is unfair. So that's why when Hitler waged war against Poland and later France, Germans overwhelmingly support this decision. Why? Because they thought that the terms, the settlement of the Treaty of Versailles is unfair. They want to overthrow this unfair treatment. So he thinks that liberalism, in fact, their suggestions just protect the interests of the haves. Those have lows, like Germans. Of course, they think that they have to use war to overthrow the whole international order in order to get a fair treatment. However, when let's say that's the history. Nowadays, the classical liberalism is quite marginal in international relations. Realist is dominant, and then there are other schools like this neoliberal institutionalism or neoliberalism. I'll talk about this later. This school of thought is now a major school, but classical liberalism is marginal school. It's not very important because it cannot stop the outbreak of Second World War. So this school is now not that important. However, even though this school is now not that important, but its theories, its suggestion, are still quite, we should still deserve to study more deeply about this school of thought, its suggestions. Mainly because some of these suggestions really can explain today's long peace. Here, you can say, this is the number of democracies on the world, international organization membership, and economic openness. These three factors has been sharply increasing since 1960s. Then, the number of wars has been sharply declining, also since 1960s. Then, think about this. The Keynesian triangle, that is, democracy, trade, as well as international organization, promotes peace. Of course, these three factors failed to promote peace in 1940s. That's why it ended up in the outbreak of Second World War. But does these three factors really can promote peace in 1960s, or even more particularly after the 1990s, that is the end of Cold War? That means, if this is the truth, then this implies that classical liberalism, this theory, have its explanation with power, is not so utopian, so idealist. It is a theory that have explanation with power. Okay, very brief. Then see you on the next video clip. That is video record lectures.